Settle in with us tonight, pour something warm, and let the fire burn a little lower than usual, because the story we have for you tonight is not a loud one. It is a quiet one, the kind that moves the way real grief moves slowly, unevenly, and never quite where you expect it to go. It is the story of a telegram that said one thing, a village that believed it completely, and a woman who was never quite so sure. We tell it now the way it was told to us, gathered here around our own small fire, and we hope you will sit with it the way we have. Her name was Margaret Ashford, though for the first 22 years of her life, she had been Margaret Call, the second daughter of a miller in a small market town where the church bell rang for weddings and funerals with almost the same tune. She married Thomas Ashford in the spring of 1914 in a ceremony so ordinary that no one who attended it could have guessed it would become, in later years, the last entirely happy afternoon of her life. Thomas was a quiet man who mended clocks and fences with the same patient hands, who read aloud to her on Sunday evenings, who had a habit of humming without noticing he was doing it. She used to tease him about the humming. She would come to miss it more than almost anything else. He left for the war in the autumn of 1915, along with most of the young men of the parish, in a train that pulled away from the platform to the sound of a brass band playing something a little too cheerful for the occasion. Margaret stood on that platform in a blue coat she had sewn herself, and she did not cry, because Thomas had asked her not to, gently, the night before. "Save it," he had said, "for when I'm not looking." She had laughed despite herself. She held on to that laugh for a long time. For 2 years the letters came, not as often as she wished, but often enough to build a kind of rhythm into her days. She learned to recognize his handwriting on an envelope from across a room, the particular slant of his capital letters, the way he always underlined her name twice. Then, in the early winter of 1917, the letters stopped, and 3 weeks later a telegram arrived instead, brief and official and utterly without mercy. Missing in action, presumed dead. No further details were given. None, it seemed, were coming. We want to be honest with you here, because honesty matters in a story like this one. What Margaret felt in that moment was not the dramatic collapse of grief you might see performed on a stage. It was quieter and stranger than that, a kind of ringing silence that seemed to follow her from room to room for days afterward. She did not scream. She did not faint. She sat very still at her kitchen table for the better part of an afternoon, turning the telegram over in her hands as though a second reading might reveal a different message than the first. It never did. That is the nature of telegrams. They do not change no matter how many times you read them. The Ashford family, Thomas's people, were not cruel, not exactly, but they were people who had already decided how the story would end, and Margaret's presence in their household became to them an awkward reminder of a chapter they wished to close. Within a month of the telegram, she was told, kindly, in the careful language people use when they want to avoid the word leave, that the family cottage 2 miles beyond the village, the one that had belonged to Thomas's great-aunt Hester before her death the previous winter, was hers to use if she wished it. It was not offered as an inheritance. It was offered as a solution to an inconvenience. Margaret understood the difference perfectly well, and she went anyway, because she had nowhere else that was truly hers. The cottage the family called Wren End had not been lived in for the better part of a year, and it showed every month of that neglect. The thatch had begun to sag over the eastern room where rain had gotten in and left a dark stain shaped absurdly like a running hair. The kitchen garden had gone to bramble and nettle. 2 of the window panes were cracked, and the well cover had rotted through in one corner so that you had to step carefully around it in the dark. The village women who came to help her settle in on the first day did so with the particular gentleness people reserve for someone they believe has already lost everything worth losing. One of them, a woman named Constance Pryor, who ran the post office, pressed a jar of plum preserve into Margaret's hands at the door and said, not unkindly, "You'll manage, I expect. You always were a steady sort." Margaret did not feel steady, but she did, in the weeks that followed, begin to manage, because there was simply nothing else to be done with the days except fill them. She cleared the garden by hand, a little each morning before the light grew too warm, learning which of the tangled growth was worth saving and which needed to be pulled entirely. She patched the thatch herself after watching the thatcher's boy do a smaller repair on a neighboring roof, standing at the fence and asking questions until he laughed and showed her properly. She mended the window panes with glazing putty bought on credit from the ironmonger, who did not charge her for it in the end, though he never said why. She learned, slowly and without any particular grace, the small, competent skills of a household run entirely alone. How to keep a fire banked through the night on half the coal it should need, how to make a single hen's eggs stretch across a week of rationed cooking, how to turn a worn coat inside out and re-sew it so the good side faced the world again. We think it is worth pausing here because this is the part of the story that is easy to rush past in the telling, and it should not be rushed. There is a particular kind of grief that does not announce itself with weeping. It shows up instead in small, specific habits. Margaret found she could not sleep on Thomas's side of the bed, so she simply stopped using that side altogether, folding herself each night into a space barely wide enough for one person out of a bed built for two. She kept his shaving mug on the shelf above the basin, though she never once considered using it for anything, and she dusted it every week with the same care she gave to nothing else in the house. These were not performances of sorrow. They were simply the shape grief took in her, private and unremarkable, and entirely her own. And we think that is truer to how grief actually behaves than anything louder could be. By the following spring, Margaret had made Wren End into something that could reasonably be called a home, if a spare and quiet one. She kept 3 hens, and eventually, a small hive of bees that she tended in a veil sewn from an old curtain, having read about beekeeping in a borrowed pamphlet, and decided, with the particular stubbornness that seemed to be growing in her, that there was no reason a woman could not learn it as well as a man. She took in mending for 2 households in the village, and later, when her stitching proved neat and reliable, she began altering uniforms for the tailor in town, work that paid modestly but steadily, and that she came to find she did not mind. There is a kind of peace, she told Constance Pryor once, in work you can see the end of. You cannot always say that about grief. It was in the early days of that second spring, while she was clearing out the small writing room that Great Aunt Hester had used at the back of the cottage, that the first small strangeness presented itself. The room had been left largely untouched since Hester's death. A roll-top desk, a shelf of ledgers, a chair with a cracked leather seat, and Margaret had put off clearing it for months, unwilling, if she was honest, to disturb what felt like the last private space of a woman she had barely known. But the desk was solid oak and useful, and she needed somewhere proper to keep her mending accounts, so on a gray Tuesday she finally opened its drawers. Most of what she found was unremarkable. Old receipts, a broken pen, a tin of buttons sorted by size with a precision that made Margaret smile despite herself. But in the bottom drawer, beneath a false panel that had warped just enough over the years to leave a hairline gap at one corner, she found a bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon, and beneath them a second, thinner bundle that had clearly been kept separate and more carefully. We should tell you now what Margaret did not yet know, though it explains a great deal of what came after. Hester Ashford had spent the last 2 years of her life as a volunteer at the sorting office attached to the county hospital, one of the many quiet, unglamorous posts filled by older women during the war, checking addresses, forwarding misdirected post, matching soldiers' letters to families who had moved or whose houses had been renumbered in the chaos of wartime administration. It was thankless, exacting work, done by candlelight in a back room, and Hester had apparently been very good at it. Most of what passed through her hands she forwarded on as she was meant to. But the bundle in the false-paneled drawer told a different, more complicated story. The first letters Margaret opened were ordinary enough, correspondence between Hester and an old friend, nothing that concerned her. It was the second bundle, the thinner one, that made her sit very still in the cracked leather chair with the gray spring light coming thin through the window. The hand on the topmost envelope was one she would have known anywhere, in any light, after any number of years. The particular slant of the capitals, her own name underlined twice. We want to be careful here because this is the heart of the story, and it deserves to be told plainly rather than dramatically. The letter was dated some 6 weeks after the telegram that had declared Thomas missing and presumed dead. It was written from a field hospital, in a hand that was clearly weakened but unmistakably his own. And it explained, in the unhurried way Thomas always explained things, that he had been separated from his unit during a chaotic retreat, wounded, and unable to send word for some time. He was recovering, he wrote. He expected to be moved further behind the lines within the fortnight, and from there, home, or as near to home as the army would allow. He had given the letter to a nurse to post, along with several others, trusting the ordinary machinery of the war to carry his words the short distance they needed to travel. That machinery, it seemed, had failed him in one small, devastating way. Somewhere in the confusion of that spring, a reorganized post route, a misfiled address, the sheer overwhelming volume of correspondence moving through a system stretched far past its design, the letter had been misrouted to the county sorting office rather than directly to the village, and had landed eventually on Hester's own desk, among a stack of letters she was meant to forward. There was no way now to know for certain why she had not sent it on. Perhaps she had meant to deliver it herself and never found the moment. Perhaps, in the exhausting monotony of that work, it had simply been set aside and then forgotten beneath the weight of everything else. Perhaps, and this was the possibility Margaret found hardest to sit with, Hester had believed, mistakenly, that a second official notice had already reached the family confirming Thomas's death, and had judged the letter no longer necessary to deliver, a kindness withheld out of a misunderstanding rather than malice. We will never know which of these it was, and neither did Margaret, and we think it is honest to say so rather than to invent a tidier answer. What Margaret knew, sitting in that quiet room with the letter trembling slightly in her hands, was this. On the date the telegram had declared her husband presumed dead, he had in fact been alive, recovering, and writing to her. What had happened between that letter and the present moment, whether he had recovered fully, whether he had been moved again, whether the war's remaining months had found him or spared him, the letter could not tell her. It was, in the truest sense, not an ending, but an opening onto an unbearable, ordinary uncertainty. Not a miracle, not a resurrection, just a fact that had been buried in a drawer for 2 years, waiting. We think it is worth pausing again here because this is the point in the story where it would be easy to reach for something larger than the truth. A dramatic reunion, a soldier appearing at the garden gate at dusk. That is not what happened, and we will not pretend otherwise for the sake of a tidier ending. What happened was smaller and, we think, more honest. Margaret did not fall to her knees. She did not weep for hours. She read the letter 3 times through, very slowly, and then she set it down on the desk and went out to feed her hens, because it was nearly evening, and they would not wait for her grief any more than her grief had waited for them. It was only later that night, sitting by the banked fire with the letter in her lap, that she allowed herself to cry quietly, without performance, for the better part of an hour, and then she stopped, and made herself a cup of tea, and read the letter once more. In the days that followed, Margaret did what a woman of her particular steadiness would do. She did not simply wait and hope in silence, and she did not chase false certainty either. She wrote, carefully and formally, to the War Office, enclosing the letter and requesting whatever further record existed of Thomas Ashford's movements after the date of his initial report as missing. She wrote also to the hospital named in the letter's heading, though she held little expectation of an answer, given how much paperwork such places had likely lost or scattered in those years. She spoke to Constance Pryor at the post office, who remembered after some thought that Hester Ashford had indeed volunteered at the county sorting office, and who helped Margaret track down the name of another woman who had worked alongside her there, a Mrs. Alderton, now retired to a cottage on the far side of the county. It took the better part of that summer, a summer Margaret spent, as she had spent the one before it, keeping her bees and mending uniforms and tending a garden that was, by now, genuinely her own in every sense that mattered, before any answer came. What came in the end was not the answer she had allowed herself, in her most private moments, to hope for. The War Office confirmed that Private Thomas Ashford had indeed been treated at the field hospital named in the letter and had been recorded as transferred onward toward a base hospital some weeks later. Beyond that point, the record simply stopped. There was no further entry, no confirmed date or place of death, no grave recorded under his name in any of the registers the clerk had access to. He was, officially, still and forever after, simply missing, a word that had once felt to Margaret like a euphemism for something more final, and that she now understood, with a clarity that was almost peaceful, to mean exactly and only what it said. Missing. Not confirmed. Not closed. We know this may not feel, to some of you listening tonight, like the ending you were hoping for. We understand that. But we think there is something true and something quietly brave in what Margaret did with that uncertainty, which is neither to abandon hope nor to let it consume the life she had, with such effort, rebuilt for herself. She kept the letter, framed simply, on the desk in what had once been Hester's writing room and was now entirely her own. She continued the small, steady rhythms of her days, the bees, the mending, the garden that grew a little fuller and a little more hers with every season. She wrote once a year, on the date the letter was dated, to the War Office, asking whether any further record had surfaced, and each year the answer was the same careful nothing. And she found, to her own quiet surprise, that she could hold both things at once: the grief that was real and had not lied to her, and the small, unresolved thread of hope that the letter had left dangling, without either one canceling out the other. There is one more small thing worth telling you, because it is the kind of detail that stays with a story long after the larger facts have settled. Mrs. Alderton, the woman who had once worked beside Hester at the sorting office, wrote back to Margaret that autumn with a memory she had turned over for weeks before deciding to share it. She recalled, she said, a particular evening near the end of Hester's time at the office, when the older woman had seemed unusually distracted, sorting the same small stack of letters over and over without quite finishing the task. When Mrs. Alderton had asked if something was wrong, Hester had said only that some letters felt heavier than others to send on, and that she sometimes wondered whether it was kinder to deliver hard news quickly or to let a family have just a little longer without it. Mrs. Alderton had thought nothing of the remark at the time. She thought a great deal of it now, she wrote, and she was sorry, on Hester's behalf, for whatever pain the delay might have caused. Margaret read that letter twice and then set it beside the framed one on the desk, and found, to her own surprise, that she was not angry. Hester had been an old woman doing a hard job in an impossible time, weighing kindness against duty in a system that gave her no good options. And Margaret had come slowly to understand that most people caught inside a war are simply doing their best with information they cannot trust and choices they never asked to make. We tell you this story tonight not because it resolves neatly, but because we think it is truer than the stories that do. Most of the women left behind in those years did not get the dramatic homecoming or the confirmed grave with a name carved cleanly into stone. Most of them got exactly what Margaret got, an uncertain middle place, neither widow nor wife in any way the law could fully name, and the daily, unglamorous work of building a life inside that uncertainty rather than waiting for it to resolve before beginning to live at all. Margaret kept the cottage the family had once offered her only as a way of being rid of her, and made it, stubbornly and skillfully, into something entirely her own. She kept her bees. She kept the letter. She kept, we think, more of herself than anyone watching her walk onto that station platform in 1915 could have predicted she would. So we leave you with the question we always leave you with, and we hope you will sit with it a while before you answer. If you found, buried in an old drawer or behind a loose stone in a forgotten room, A piece of the past that changed nothing certain, but everything you understood about waiting. Would you want to know it? Would you rather live inside a clean, closed grief, or an open, honest uncertainty that never quite lets you go, but never quite lies to you either? We think Margaret would tell you there is no wrong answer, only the one that lets you keep living while you carry it. Thank you for settling in with us tonight, for sharing this quiet hour by our own small fire. We read your thoughts in the comments the way we read old letters, slowly, carefully, glad for every word you send our way. Until our next story, take care of yourselves and take care of each other.